Now it's time to get to this week's front page story in Farmers Weekly, thanks to the wonderful journalism of Richard Rennie as he continues to follow the developments in our forestry sector. Reported that the government has signalled it intends to push ahead with its aim to enable councils to limit the area that can be placed in trees in some parts of the country. Prodded by concerns from members of the rural sector prior to the election, Agricultural Minister Damien O'Connor has moved on his promise after the election to restrict forest plantings over 50 hectares on land use capability classes of 1 to 5. Of course, land use capability on different things has been associated with the likes of dairy and horticulture on 1 to 3, and forestry typically 6 to 7, to give you a bit of an understanding. This is the steep gradient topography of our land here in this country. We're joined now by Phil Taylor, President of the Forest Owners Association. Good evening, Phil.
Good evening, Sarah. How are you?
Good. It's a very in-depth story on the front page that Richard goes into a lot of detail. For those who are not familiar with the angst of the sheep and beef community in New Zealand wanting to really slow back large-scale forestry, it has been exacerbated by Baker Ag Consultants' report, really honing in on nearly 700 local jobs potentially lost in the Wairoa area, with 24 million less spent in the local economy. You disagree?
Yeah, look, I do, Sarah. And look, I think the Baker Ag report has had more airtime than it deserves. You know, it looks at one particular region of New Zealand, and no doubt there are issues within that region. But you know, a more reliable independent report prepared by PwC and contracted by Te Rākau demonstrated exactly the opposite claims that Baker Ag report was claiming, particularly around the contribution to the economy and also, importantly, rural employment.
Okay, so the policy. Could you allow us in some more insight into the details of what it's currently like in the environment for conversion to forestry, and why you're so concerned about needing resource consent on 50 hectares or more in under 5 classed land?
Yeah, well, I guess, Sarah, our main concern is that with the government over the last 6 years, we've developed what's called a National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry. And that went through a large degree of consultation, a great deal of thought. And out of that National Environmental Standard, which was designed to ensure that the rules for forestry were common across New Zealand to the extent possible, forestry was a permitted activity on all but the highest erosion-prone land. And we believe that that level of control is entirely appropriate, and that Minister Connor's suggestion to place further regulations on forestry just perpetuates the siloed thinking that we've been seeing in terms of response to issues.
It is a consistent theme, though, that the government is placing a licence to operate across all of our classes of land in this country, regardless of the land use, though, Phil, and forestry should come under that if other classes should as well. I'm talking about sheep and beef and dairy in certain areas.
Well, it's interesting that the forest industry was the first industry to develop a national environmental standard for plantation forestry, and that is a document that has regulatory status under the Resource Management Act. We don't have an environmental standard for agriculture at the moment, so in many respects, the forestry industry is well advanced in terms of its impacts on the rural land use.
And let's talk about this. There has been a lot of social licence eroded, excuse the pun, when we had the Tolaga Bay incident, where there was a huge amount of slash that poured off those hills in a adverse event, weather event we must state. But there has been, we are assured from the Forest Owners Association and the industry, tidying up its act around this type of behaviour.
Yeah, I look totally, Sarah. I've been on public record saying that that's not good enough, and the forest industry has taken ownership for that and will continue to take ownership of that Tolaga Bay. You know, like many industries, we do have our Achilles heels. Our challenge and our commitment to New Zealand is to make sure we up the game in that area. You know, social license to operate is absolutely critical for our industry, and many forest owners around New Zealand are investing heavily in building trust in communities and fronting up for challenges and issues that have created angst with our neighbours and communities is part of earning back that trust. And I actually believe that, that trust level is very high. What we're hearing, our view is from relatively small parts of the rural community who quite rightly feel some angst, they feel threatened. Sheep and beef numbers in New Zealand, beef numbers have gone down 28% since 1994. Sheep numbers have gone down 44% since 1994. So clearly the industry is under some serious challenges. But the sort of response the government's looking at, to me, reflects sort of siloed thinking, where they're trying to manage conflicting objectives with different policies that don't actually produce anything. They need to take a further and sort of a big picture look at how they address the real challenging issues around climate, around the environment, and around society's expectations of rural land users, forestry, agriculture, everybody.
I'm trying to find out what good looks like if we are to come around the table and have some constructive conversations, because it has been extremely heated and fuelled by politicians in the last Labour-led coalition government. We have a Labour majority government and Minister of Agriculture also wearing a hat of Minister of Trade under this new government ahead. I mean, but there has been considerable rise in plantations. I'm reading here 58,000 hectares of new planted area between 2009 and 2019 was from improved pastures, and the rest was unimproved pastures. 40% was from unimproved pastures, my apologies. You've got to acknowledge, though, that there has been candy to children in terms of the free-for-all of the encouragement of planting forests across New Zealand. It hasn't been well managed.
Yeah, can I respond to it? I'll respond to that question, but I'll just make a couple of points.
Yes.
I think it's unfair to say the politicians have fueled this fire, as you put it. I think what they have done is they have politically responded to a relatively small group in the rural community who have some genuine fears, but those fears are not necessarily replicated across the wider rural community. That's the first point I'd make. In terms of the increase in afforestation in recent time, that is a relatively recent phenomenon. Since 1990, since 2005, there's been a loss of around about 100,000 hectares of plantation forests that have been converted into dairy. So, and this just reflects the importance of dynamic land use in the rural economy. All rural land owners want to have the choice to use their land to best advantage, whether that be economic, social, and environmental. And our biggest concern is that, the government is going to, as I say, continue this sort of lack of big picture thinking and the siloed approach to policy development that will just perpetuate the continuing underutilization of the rural land. And so we've got to do something different. And part of that is about engaging as communities and trying to find solutions.
And so I come to that question, what does good look like in your mind?
Well, good will look different to different people. I mean, for me personally, I think good looks like having mature and sensible conversations about land use, rural land use in New Zealand, the understanding each party's position. I think seeing more trees integrated into farming, because clearly with those numbers I was talking about in decline in herd numbers, there is something fundamentally challenging the sustainability of rural land use, particularly agriculture in New Zealand. And so something needs to be done differently. And I think there's a real opportunity for farmers to work with foresters in improving the resilience of their farms, addressing New Zealand's climate change issues, or helping address New Zealand climate change issues. So look, Sarah, I mean, I'm really excited about the future, and I think there's some really exciting opportunities. But what we need to do is we need to get away from this historical way of thinking about regulation and responding with regulation to minority interest groups.
Okay, you talked about the economics of land use, Phil. How fair is effectively a subsidy from a very high overpriced carbon credit ETS situation where in the ability to even compete in other forms of land use?
Well, again, that's an interesting question, because I guess you might argue that having agricultural outside of the ETS and not meeting its climate change emission obligations is in effect a subsidy. That is a direct subsidy by the New Zealand taxpayer. So if we're going to talk about subsidies, let's be open and honest about where these subsidies are occurring. There is no question that the ETS and carbon price is changing the rural land values. But again, there are some real opportunities for farmers in that. I mean, all we hear about at this stage is the threat to farming over high carbon prices, but it presents some huge opportunities. It will help build the resilience I was talking about that farmers can look for towards the future to halt those declining stock numbers.
And it's an interesting conversation to have that really touches on the emotions of our identity and the different classes of farmer or grower that we identify with, isn't it? Because effectively we are land custodians, and whatever way we source our income from that particular certificate of title is different to everybody. But we have such a cultural identity to who we see ourselves as in terms of which one we choose.
Yeah, look, quite right. And look, those views will change over time and will change over generations. And, one of the fundamental strengths of the New Zealand economy, and particularly rural land use, is the ability to swap in and out of different uses depending on economic, social, environmental, climate change requirements. I mean, let's not forget that the majority of farmland that we farm in New Zealand now once came out of forests. Let's not forget that over 100,000 hectares of forest was cleared in the early 2000s to convert to dairy farming. And that made sense because there was a good economic and social justification for it. Just as there is now to start looking at maybe it's time to convert some of that lower productivity farmland into forestry.
And of course, I do want to talk around natives as well. And our Forest Owners Association is not all just about pine plantations either, is it? Again, another misunderstanding.
Look, to be fair, the majority of the ownership, the members of the Forest Owners Association are tree planters, plantation forest owners, using traditionally imported exotic species. But that's not to say that they don't have some very serious commitments to environmental enhancement, habitat protection. But by and large, the commercial aspects of their business are founded on exotic species. And that's simply because indigenous trees are so much more expensive to plant and they take so much longer to grow.
Okay, I do want to challenge you on that, and I have a comment here around the obligations under the Biosecurity Act, and I believe that we have talked about this. But I mean, I've been in the North Island a lot lately, driving past some very tall stands of plantations, and there's not much biodiversity going on the ground floor of a pine plantation, Phil, and pests are able to run rampant through that, which is not really fair on the neighbouring sheep and beef farm, is it?
Look, Sarah, I'm sorry, I have to strongly disagree with you in terms of biodiversity and habitat. The New Zealand forest industry has a huge commitment to enhancing and maintaining habitat for endangered flora and fauna. And that undoubtedly there are some forests that you can go into at high stockings where there is limited habitat for indigenous species. But equally well, some of our most endangered species live in forests. The New Zealand falcon is a classic example. My own company is doing a huge amount of work with the long-tailed bat in South Canterbury, the gecko lizard, the kokako. And so, again, I think it's unfair to categorise forests as environmental deserts. They simply are not.
Hey, and this is why we have these conversations here on Sarah's Country, because I learned so much from you, like I have from each and every guest tonight, and it's really extended my thinking, and I hope those who are listening and viewing Sarah's Country has also done the same. I do hope that, I do hear more bird life, though, in those particular parts, and also where we can have a balanced discussion around natives and exotics. Phil, as well, because we are so passionate about our native trees in this country.
Well, Sarah, we're neighbours. You're just down the road from me here in Christchurch. I would love to take you out in the forest and spend some time with you. Cool. Let's do a visit to a forest, get some live TVs in there and do this show from inside a forest.
Oh, how cool would that be? Absolutely. And hear the bird song that Phil tells me is there and does exist.
Yep.
Oh, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Phil. And what a great way to showcase something I opened with, which was a particular type of farming and growing here in this country that I haven't seen behind the scenes of, and that is our forestry industry. I have to admit that. Phil, just to close, can I ask you, because I have failed to ask this of the other guests, What is a type of food or fibre or fashion item that we produce here in this country that you'd love to see behind the scenes? It's completely different to what you do in a day-to-day.
I would love to see some of the amazing work that Scion are doing in their biomaterials, the circular bioeconomy work that is sort of going to be a huge industry in the future that's built off the foundations of the New Zealand forest industry. There's really great stuff in there.
I absolutely love how you certainly brought that background. Very diplomatic of you. Thank you so much. That's Phil Taylor, CEO of Forest Owners Association.
This is Sarah's Country.